Hello everyone, I'm Flick and welcome to something a little bit different for the channel. The topic today is the Batman miniature game created by Night Models, a company based out of Madrid, Spain. The tabletop skirmish game that pits two crews of iconic characters and associated henchmen set in the DC universe against each other, and has been featured on my channel since day one, basically, in the form of over 100 battle reports, numerous unboxing videos, and things like that spread across a few years. To say I'm a fan of the game would be an understatement. The third edition of the game, which is the current edition if you aren't aware, is my favourite version of it that's existed. It plays well with enough depth for tactics to matter, while still incorporating good old-fashioned dice luck into the equation as well. While I do have some complaints about the miniature quality, I can't fault the general design or level of detail. To say I'm the primary source of content for the Batman miniature game on YouTube would also be an understatement. Sporadically, there's other channels which cover it, as well as occasionally sponsored content from some larger channels, but that's really about it. And this leads to the point of this video. Why is it like that when the game and miniatures released for it are decent, attached to a well-known license with well-known characters? I mean, who hasn't heard of Batman? This video is about a major problem facing the Batman miniature game. It isn't about some of the erratic decision makings by a company with a spotty past, and it isn't about the small errors that slip through in the Spanish to English translation progress, and it isn't about tweaking character balance based on the whims of a misguided, albeit dedicated, small group of fans. I'm not saying that these things don't matter. These are all important things that could be done differently, but there is a far, far larger issue facing this miniature game, and I don't want to see it die out completely, so that's why I made this video. So, what is the biggest problem in my opinion? Rather than simply pleading my case for what I think the biggest issue is, I'd rather demonstrate it using a small sample size of 3 friends of mine, each with different levels of familiarity with miniature games in general, and specifically the Batman miniature game by Night Models. So first we have friend 1, who lives in Europe and is very familiar with miniature games. He collects and paints models from numerous other games, and has played games of the Batman miniature game with me digitally more than a few times. Friend 2 lives in America and is generally familiar with larger miniature games like ones created by Games Workshop, and collected some of them when he was much younger. He's never played the Batman miniature game though, and is only passingly aware of anything at all to do with it. Friend 3 lives in Australia and has never collected any miniature games. They play D&D, they're aware of the basics of what miniature games generally involve, but it's not something they have any experience with. They are essentially starting as close to zero as someone can get. Taking these 3 friends with 3 different levels of experience with miniature games and from different ends of the earth, I set them the following relatively simple task, with no guidance, or as little as possible, from me or anyone else who's already played the Batman miniature game. I challenged them to source the following: a 3rd edition Batman miniature game starter box, a fully playable crew that is not included in the starter box, and anything else needed to play the game. On the final point, I was specifically vague. 2 out of 3 would be looking at this miniature game with fresh eyes, from the perspective of a new customer. 1 has enough knowledge that they'll do fine sourcing what they need, but I was curious how the others would do. It's also important that they keep track of the cost of anything they find that falls into those 3 categories I just listed. The buy-in to a miniature game being too high can often be a stopping point for people, so I felt it was worth tracking as well as part of the little experiment. And so that means the end goal of all this would be finding an estimated total cost to start playing the Batman miniature game from 3 vastly different parts of the world, as well as a way to gauge their understanding of what exactly is and is not needed to play the game as we head into 2024. I wasn't expecting this to be a smooth process, quite the opposite, and that finally brings us to the point of this video. The biggest problem facing the Batman miniature game is that it suffers as a result of how incomprehensible it is as a product to buy into. For a potential new player that finds out about the game from a YouTube video, or seeing the models in a store, or maybe even seeing a tournament being run at their friendly local gaming store, just how easy is it for them to get into the game? How much resistance are they going to meet with what they need to decipher in order to play? Is there so much resistance that they'll just give up, stop caring, and move on to something else instead? That's what I want to know. Night Models lists the following steps needed to play their game. How accurate and useful are these? How easy are they to find? Are they easy to follow? I'm not so sure they are. This is the biggest problem I see facing the game in terms of keeping it alive and growing, and with all that in mind, let's see how the experiment with my 3 friends panned out. Friend 1, being the most familiar with the game, would have the easiest time with the challenge. I included them mostly to provide the correct answer, so to speak. They knew to have the app, from which you can see stat cards, objective cards for all crews and models, eternal or otherwise, in order to plan out a crew that you want to play as. They knew that in order to track the actual playing of a game, they would need to print out the stat cards and objective cards, and where to find them in order to do that. They also sourced a local gaming store, which had the Batman-themed 3rd edition starter box, which is the most recent starter box, for €85. They were unsure what precisely came in the starter box game element wise, such as sewer and lamp markers, but they knew those were needed in general. They set themselves the personal challenge of filling out the extra full 350 rep crew without buying more than 3 extra boxes along with the starter set. They were able to do this from their local store. They could get a 350 rep Bane crew that they wanted to put together for exactly 3 additional boxes, totaling €118. That brings the total buy-in to €203 once you include the starter set they found, plus printing out any necessary stat cards, objective cards, etc. once you found the PDFs. As they went through this process, they noted that they stumbled on the Batman Miniature Game website, where the PDFs and other digital resources required to play are located, by accident. They found no obvious link from Night Model's own website. The app also crashed 3 times while they were trying to put together their Bane crew, although at time of recording, the app is in a bit of a flux as it's being updated fairly frequently. Given that they also collect numerous other miniature games, they were also generally aware that they needed buildings or other scenery, and they had enough that they could throw together a Gotham City-esque play area on a 3x3 area by themselves. It's worth noting that the starter box they did source comes with no scenery at all. Finally, I asked friend 1 to try and put themselves in the boots of someone utterly familiar with the game, which granted is probably pretty hard to do. They'd maybe seen the models, they thought they were cool, wanted to know more. How would they feel if they just bought that starter box and nothing else? They opened it to find that there's unusable, out-of-date objective cards, no stat cards, no scenery, and a now out-of-date rulebook. Would they even know these things are out of date? And also, how difficult, in general, would they rate getting into the Batman miniature game out of 10, with 10 being extremely difficult? His answer at first was a 4, but when I clarified that he wouldn't have known the objectives in the rulebook in the starter box are out of date unless I told him, he said there was no indication of that, so he'd play using the content of the box thinking it was correct. This would obviously lead to confusion and perhaps frustration down the line, making the overall difficulty to get into the game a little higher than his initial rating. Let's move on to friend 2 from America. They were very pragmatic when I told them the challenge. They immediately went to Night Model's own website to pick out the things they thought they needed to play the game, totaling just under €190. Here's what he thought was required, starting from a near 0 point but having a general idea of how miniature games are played. He noted that he wasn't sure if the starter box was correct or not, as 3rd edition is not mentioned on the Batman box at all. He was also not aware of any postage costs or potential import fees upon arrival in his country. I asked him to try and source the same things from more local American stores. He did this pretty quickly. He found that it would be cheaper to buy locally and that stock levels were actually pretty decent. He stumbled upon Night Model's recommended list of things to get started with the game, which I showed you earlier, but here it is again. And this pointed him to the app. He found that it didn't work on his version of Android phone. It wouldn't even let him download it. I haven't heard of this specific issue with the app, and I'm not sure what caused it, but by the time this is heard by you, it might be resolved. I reminded him about needing cards to physically play the game, and he went looking for those instead. After some time, he stumbled on the Batman Miniature Game website and found the relevant PDFs. The character cards, by the way, are created by community members and not the company itself. They just provide the rulebook and objective cards for printing. At this point, I asked him how he would feel as a brand new player that had just purchased the Batman themed starter box and discovered that inside of it was out-of-date objective cards, an out-of-date rulebook, no scenery, and no stat cards. I asked him to score the difficulty of getting into the game out of 10. After being more than a little bit flabbergasted, he estimated the difficulty at 7 or 8 and promptly wanted to be done with my little experiment, but not before compiling a list of his own observations, which I've had to edit some colourful language out of, sorry, but you can see those on the screen now. Oh boy, let's move on to friend 3. he was the most difficult, starting from complete zero interest or knowledge about skirmish miniature games and living in a country with notoriously high prices for hobbies like this, so it was always going to be a challenge no matter what game it was. His initial attempts to learn about the game comprised of visiting local hobby store websites and finding either out of stock listings or extremely expensive listings that were still in stock. As an example, he found the starter box for the equivalent of €140 just for the one thing. He had no idea which starter set, as there's been 3 so far for 3rd edition, it was, whether it was the most recent or otherwise, and no idea what the difference between any of them were. I prodded him in the direction of using the official site to try and learn more. Keeping in mind his total cold start, he really struggled to even understand what he needed to play the game. Later he came back, having put together and sourced a rough idea of a League of Assassins list using the app, including their old objective deck, and to buy them would total roughly €92. The things he picked out would have not been a full 350 rep crew, so he wouldn't have been able to play the game. It came to roughly 220. And it was that time again. I asked him the same question I asked the other two. I asked him to rate his experience out of 10 difficulty wise, and he decided on a 7.5, adding that he would have been furious if he got everything he picked out and was then told he needed to hunt down more resources. And finally, he added that sourcing anything to do with the game in Australia would be far too difficult in general. That concludes the experiment I ran with my 3 friends. 2 out of the 3 were very glad it's over, but I do have some more to add. When the Batman starter box launched, a few channels much larger than mine were given complimentary copies in order to film unboxing videos for their audiences. I took a look through the comment sections of these videos to see what the general reaction was, and picked out some negative comments that repeated sentiments often expressed by people about why they wouldn't buy in upon watching the video. Not surprisingly, game balance wasn't mentioned once, as far as I could tell. By far the biggest turn-off vocalised by people was the lack of stat cards in the starter box, so you can't simply play out the box when you purchase it. The reliance on a companion app was also a big turn-off for a lot of people in general. Some also disliked the lack of scenery. So where does that put us in conclusion? This of course isn't an exhaustive list of problems facing the game, but it does focus on the biggest problem to its longevity in my opinion, which is how to entice new players to buy in. That ultimately is the most important thing for the life of the game, is bringing in new blood, as it were. Balance is important too, but that's past the onboarding bottleneck, the place where new players get stuck when they buy a starter box that doesn't have everything they need, when they need to spend over €100 just to get a full crew that only provides the models and nothing else, not even assembly instructions, when they need to print off stat cards and objective cards since the app isn't fit for purpose and hasn't been for almost 3 years at this point, when you're faced with sheer confusion and incoherence and not entirely sure what's up to date, what's right and what's wrong. The worst part is that even if a new player fights through all these things, what are they met with next? An app that has constantly changed cards with vague balance updates that come across as slapdash and random. During the production of this video, the patch note, "Scarecrow Crew Mechanics Updated," was added to the app, with no indication of what specifically was changed, who changed, in what way, or the reasoning behind what was changed. How in any way is that helpful? There are other games with high barriers to entry. I feel it would be safe to say Battletech and Infinity might be other examples of games that seem daunting to get into for new players. Battletech certainly was for me. But unlike the Batman miniature game, if you pierce through that barrier to entry, there's not much more in terms of roadblocks or potholes to get in your way. The Batman miniature game is a game I really enjoy playing, with miniatures that look great, and I enjoy painting them too, but Night Model's frankly bizarre approach to how they run their game makes it very hard to recommend to new players. I can't just say, just buy this starter box, it has everything you and a friend need, as that wouldn't be true. I can't say, if you want this different crew, just buy these 1 to 3 boxes and you can play as them, because that isn't true. I can't say, just download their app, it does everything you need, because at time of recording, that still isn't true either. What I can say is, first you've got to buy the starter set, if you can find one in stock someplace, to get all the basic tokens you need. Then you need to download and use the app to put together the crew you want, buying additional models if they aren't in the starter set. Then you've got to go find the PDFs to print those off, and you've got to get those double-sided stat cards printed off as well, of course. Don't forget your 30 objective cards. Yes, 30, not 20, like your version of the rulebook probably says. because the rulebook's been updated now, and the rules for objective decks have as well, so you've got to print off the PDF of the newly updated rulebook. Oh, and you're using one of those old neutral objective deck cards from one of the starter boxes? Yeah, those are out of date as well. Those need to get printed off too. You've got to print off the new ones and wait until the first quarter of 2024 when there might be a huge card pack that'll probably be quite expensive, but that might cover most of your needs. Oh, and you'll need to find someone else who's willing to do all this if you want someone to play against. I know it isn't an insurmountable task. It's doable. Of course it is. My point is, how many people are going to go through all that willingly without giving up or getting too frustrated or backing down once they meet enough resistance? I don't see the game gaining traction. It feels like the launch of 3rd edition was pretty squandered, and any potential momentum from the launch of 3rd edition has certainly long since ground to a halt. So I'm fairly confident many aren't bothering with it. All we're left with is people only interested in collecting the models without playing the game, which is fine. Or tiny insular communities too obsessed with being the arbiters of game balance, like that's the stopping point preventing the game being the next big thing when it isn't. I want the game to do better, but more importantly, I want the game to be better, and I hope, at very least in a small way, I've been able to convey my opinions, constructive criticisms, and honestly, frustrations with you here today. I think that about does it, so thank you for listening if you made it this far to the end. If you are curious about learning more about the Batman miniature game, I'll put some relevant links in the description box below to both Night Models' website and their unique website for just the Batman miniature game. And if you are interested, I have a huge backlog on the channel of old battle reports, unboxings, and that kind of thing, if you want to know more. Thank you once again for listening this far if you did. Enjoy the rest of your day, and ta-ta for now.